Adjust diet, promote exercise, medication treatment. When Filch asked how to explain Mrs. Norris's problem, Sherlock didn't beat around the bush and gave a straightforward answer. Temporarily reduce food intake, adopt small frequent meals to reduce the burden on the stomach. Choose more easily digestible food, such as canned cat food with higher water content. You can also use probiotics and anti-bloating medications, such as simethicone and so on. Filch, phi, degree winky face phi. What was all that about? Despite listening very carefully, Filch still felt as if he were trying hard to learn magic. Canned cat food, probiotics, simethicone. He dared to swear that even the most complex spells he'd ever seen were not as difficult to understand as Sherlock's words. But seeing Mrs. Norris, who had been listless during this period, now nuzzling contentedly in Sherlock's arms, looking comfortable and happy, Filch could only suppress his doubts and listen carefully like a diligent student. And so, Sherlock walked forward holding Mrs. Norris, with Filch following closely beside him. One spoke, the other listened, until they walked to near the edge of the forbidden forest. Only then did Filch realize, wait, shouldn't I be the one leading the way? Why would he know where I was going? Before Filch could voice his question, Hagrid's voice could already be heard in the distance. Is that you, Filch? Hurry up, I'm about to set off. Here you go. Hearing Hagrid's voice, Sherlock smoothly handed Mrs. Norris to Filch. Noticing that Mrs. Norris, who usually only clung to him and never gave others a pleasant face, was now tightly gripping Sherlock and unwilling to leave his embrace, Filch's face darkened. He felt as if he had lost something important. As for his earlier question, it was naturally pushed to the back of his mind. Follow what I told you for now. During this time, I'll have my family send some cat food and anti-bloating medications suitable for her. Sherlock still spoke in his calm tone. A conflicted look appeared on Filch's face. He wanted to say he didn't need it, but seeing Mrs. Norris's bright, sparkling eyes looking at him hopefully, he finally compromised. Thank you, Mr. Holmes. Heaven knows how much determination it took for him to say those words. At this moment, Hagrid had also walked up to Sherlock and Filch. He looked at the two getting along harmoniously and was somewhat surprised. From his understanding of Filch, this guy should be lecturing Holmes at a time like this, right? They were getting along surprisingly well? Could it be that Holmes was so capable that he could even handle Filch, this old coot with his strange personality? If that were true, it would be a good thing. The more capable Holmes was, the more advantageous it would be for investigating the Forbidden Forest. Filch, from now on, I'm in charge here. Good. Filch glanced at Sherlock, nodded to him, and left straightforwardly. Even after Filch's figure disappeared, Hagrid still found it hard to believe. He scratched the back of his head and couldn't help asking, Holmes, how did you do it? Why was that old coot so nice to you? Did you tell him about deliberately getting detention? In his view, only if Sherlock told Filch he was working for Dumbledore would the other party be so polite. No, I gave him some catnip. I see. Hagrid suddenly understood and grinned. That guy may be annoying, but he's quite good to his cat. Obviously, Hagrid, who was familiar with magical creatures, also understood the use of catnip. The two chatted as they walked forward, soon reaching the edge of the Forbidden Forest. A cold wind blew through, and even the robust Hagrid couldn't help but shrink his neck. In contrast, Sherlock had already cast a warming charm on himself early on, so he didn't feel anything. Hagrid naturally wouldn't notice these details. He held up his lamp high and pointed to a narrow path that gradually disappeared into the depths of the dark forest, saying to Sherlock, Holmes, look over there. That silvery white glowing thing is unicorn blood. Sherlock looked intently and indeed saw the silvery white reflective substance Hagrid mentioned. This was the difference between the magical world and the Muggle world. In Muggle detective experience, there was always the saying, black mud, white stone, reflective water. This meant that at night or in poor lighting conditions, black areas were most likely muddy ground, white places were stones and other relatively hard objects, and reflective parts were most likely accumulated water. This saying could help people avoid stepping into mud or water when walking, allowing safer progress in complex outdoor environments. But in the magical world, this experience obviously didn't apply. Hagrid continued, Here's what happened. A unicorn in the Forbidden Forest was injured by something badly hurt. Actually, last week I found one dead. The other creatures in the Forbidden Forest wouldn't harm them, so I think there must be poachers who have infiltrated. Even if we can't investigate the cause clearly, it would be best to find that poor unicorn first and put it out of its misery. Clearly, Hagrid was very melancholy. The various animals in the Forbidden Forest were all his good friends, especially when sacred and pure creatures like unicorns were injured or even killed. This couldn't be considered normal by any measure. Hagrid had been investigating for 2 weeks but still found nothing. When he reported about the dragon egg to Dumbledore, he suddenly thought of Sherlock's unique abilities. So, he tentatively suggested asking Sherlock to help with the investigation. Unexpectedly, Dumbledore agreed immediately. The rest followed naturally. Hagrid talked at length, also telling Sherlock about the unicorn's characteristics. Sherlock listened carefully and didn't ask questions at first. Only after Hagrid finished did he ask a few questions, which Hagrid answered in detail. Put the unicorn out of its misery? Sherlock shook his head. Forgive me for being direct, Hagrid, but your thinking is wrong. What are you saying? Hagrid stared wide-eyed. Putting the unicorn out of its misery no longer matters much. If this really was done by poachers, then we should put him out of his misery instead. Hagrid was immediately startled. He looked carefully at Sherlock in the moonlight and found he didn't seem to be joking. Now he began to regret suggesting to Dumbledore that Sherlock participate in the investigation. Sherlock Holmes was indeed a Gryffindor. While this was gratifying in some ways, some things needed to be made clear in advance. Listen, Holmes, I admit you're very capable, even able to see through people like Dumbledore. But if there really are poachers who have infiltrated the Forbidden Forest and seriously injured and killed unicorns, then he's a dangerous individual, definitely not someone a first-year student like you can handle. Hagrid paused here, then continued. The Forbidden Forest is dangerous, especially at night. But as long as you stay with me and Fong, no creature in the Forbidden Forest will harm you. Sherlock, oh. What do you mean by, oh? I mean, I understand. What I said just now was only a suggestion. The slow-witted Hagrid nodded upon hearing this. Good to know, good to know. Harry, lurking nearby under his invisibility cloak, almost laughed out loud. Not long ago in astronomy class, Sherlock had told him the inside story of getting detention, and also had him put on the invisibility cloak to come along. In reality, this was equivalent to testing the results of their recent special training. Harry, whose adventurous spirit had already been awakened, was naturally extremely excited. However, he hadn't expected that before the special training officially began, he would witness so many exciting scenes. Filch left him greatly puzzled, and Hagrid made him want to laugh. It was really too interesting. Much more interesting than night tours of Hogwarts. After getting Sherlock's assurance, Hagrid led him into the much-feared Forbidden Forest. As he walked, he observed Sherlock becoming more and more puzzled. Although Sherlock was indeed a Gryffindor, he was fundamentally just an 11-year-old young wizard. Why couldn't he see any nervousness on his face? On the contrary, looking at his bright, sparkling eyes, he seemed to have an expectant expression. Sherlock was indeed full of anticipation for the Forbidden Forest. If there were such an area in the Muggle world, he probably would have completed his exploration within a month of starting school. It was precisely because this was the magical world, and Sherlock initially knew nothing about magic, that he had endured for so long. Heaven knows how difficult it was for someone with his adventurous spirit to endure. 5 months. Do you know how he spent these 5 months? But since he had already waited 5 months, he wasn't in a hurry for this moment. Sherlock discreetly gestured behind him, signaling Harry not to fall behind, then directly asked, By the way, Hagrid, the Christmas gift you gave us, that flute should be made of special materials, right? Poison horn? Camel horn? Or mooncalf tentacle? Sherlock, I didn't expect you to know so much. Hagrid's way of addressing Sherlock changed once again. But you were wrong from the start. That thing isn't a magical creature's horn at all. Really? Sherlock looked surprised. I thought it was an animal's tentacle because it looked so hard. That's a layman's view. Hagrid laughed happily. Actually, I made it from the shell of a color-change snail. You know about color-change snails, right? They're a type of giant snail. Besides being used to make Veritaserum antidote, their hard shells have many other uses too. Since they change color every hour, I thought making them into flutes would be quite nice. Indeed, very nice. Sherlock praised, then asked again, Hagrid, you've been at Hogwarts for so long, you must be very familiar with the magical creatures in the Forbidden Forest? Getting information from Hagrid was very easy. As long as you found a slight pretext, he would spill all the information you wanted to know. This even made Sherlock wonder if Snape's Veritaserum had Hagrid's saliva as one of its main ingredients. If not, it might be worth considering adding some. The effect would definitely be good. Sure enough, after hearing Sherlock's words, Hagrid perked up and began talking enthusiastically. Sherlock followed Hagrid, continuously walking deeper into the Forbidden Forest. Hagrid held Fong with one hand while constantly scanning the surroundings with his eyes, introducing the Forbidden Forest to Sherlock. Don't let this Forbidden Forest's mystery fool you. There are countless magical creatures inside, but I'm friends with all of them. Take Aragog, for instance. Although he's frighteningly large and his bite could numb you for half a day, he's actually a little cutie I adopted when I was in school. If today's timing weren't inappropriate, I'd definitely take you to meet this old friend. Those sacred and beautiful unicorns. They're snow white all over, with horns that shine like silver. They usually love to quietly graze and wander by the springs in the forest, with the gentlest temperaments. But now, they've met with this terrible misfortune. The centaurs have also settled here. They're very clever, understanding astronomy and geography better than we do, though their tempers are a bit unpredictable. But if you accidentally encounter them, as long as you make your intentions clear, there's usually no big problem. Going deeper, there are also two-horned beasts, spotted earth dwellers, thestrals, bowtruckles, grindylows, puffballs, and werewolves. Though they're not commonly seen in normal times, during specific periods, like full moon nights, you still need to be on guard. In short, the Forbidden Forest is far more dangerous than you imagine. You must stay close to me. Before he could finish speaking, Hagrid suddenly pulled Sherlock behind a tall oak tree. At the same time, he quickly drew an arrow and loaded it into his crossbow, aiming at the original path. Damn, something's coming. Sherlock had noticed the anomaly even earlier than Hagrid. He keenly heard what sounded like a cloak dragging something across the ground, but it was covered by Hagrid's loud voice, even though he had already lowered his voice. However, Hagrid's reaction wasn't slow either. Just as Sherlock was about to speak up as a reminder, Hagrid had already taken countermeasures. Sherlock even felt that Hagrid's aura at this moment was different from before. Who's there? Come out. Hagrid stared alertly at the side path and shouted, Come out quickly, I'm armed. Seeing Hagrid being so tough, Fong immediately began running back and forth at Hagrid's and Sherlock's feet. Not only that, he also bared his teeth toward the direction the sound came from. Combined with his fierce appearance, he really looked like he was putting on airs. The creature lurking in the darkness didn't keep Sherlock and Hagrid waiting long. Soon, a strange creature walked into their line of sight. This creature's upper body was human-like, with red hair and beard. But from the waist down, including the lower body, was a shining chestnut-colored horse body, with a long red tail trailing behind. Its tail was swishing back and forth, showing some irritation. With such obvious characteristics, Sherlock recognized them immediately. Centaurs, or rather, half-horse beings. In the sky, they were represented by the constellations Centaurus and Sagittarius, originally existing only in Greek mythological legends. But as the doors of the magical world officially opened to Sherlock, he learned that such magical creatures really existed in this world. It's worth noting that centaurs themselves were a species, not hybrids of half-human and half-beast. Some terrible literary works describe them this way. Oh, it's you, Ronan. Hagrid obviously recognized the centaur who suddenly appeared. He breathed a long sigh of relief and greeted him, How are you? Not well, Hagrid. However, the centaur called Ronan didn't seem very happy. His voice was low and sorrowful. You were going to shoot me? Hey, don't be like that. Hagrid ignored Ronan's emotional change, stepped forward and forcibly shook hands with him. Had to be on guard, Ronan. As if to strengthen his persuasiveness, he even patted his quiver. Look, there's a bad guy roaming around in this forest. After saying this, he introduced Sherlock and Ronan to each other. The centaur named Ronan wasn't interested in Sherlock. After a simple greeting, he raised his head and said, Mars is bright tonight. Hagrid looked up at the sky, then agreed. Yes, indeed very bright. By the way, Ronan, a unicorn in the Forbidden Forest has been injured. Have you seen anything? Even though Sherlock wasn't interested in astronomy, he could be certain that Hagrid hadn't found Mars in the sky. Ronan didn't answer but continued to stare unblinkingly at the sky. After a long while, he sighed. Always the innocent are the first to suffer. It has been so for centuries, and it is so now. Yes. Hagrid was already somewhat perfunctory at this point. I mean, have you noticed anything unusual recently? Mars is bright tonight. Ronan repeated this sentence again. Hagrid. I know, it is indeed unusually bright. But what I mean is, in the area near us, have there been any abnormal situations? Or, haven't you noticed any strange movements? Hagrid had obviously lost his patience. However, Ronan still didn't answer. Just then, there was more movement in the bushes behind Ronan. Hagrid had just raised his crossbow when a second centaur appeared. This one had black hair and beard and looked wilder than Ronan. "Hello, Bane." Hagrid obviously knew this one too. After greeting him, he began asking, "I was just asking Ronan, a unicorn has been injured. Have you discovered anything unusual recently?" "Good evening, Hagrid." Bane walked over and stood beside Ronan, looking up at the sky. After a moment he spoke, "Mars is bright tonight." Hagrid, hashtag. We've already heard that. Hagrid was already very irritated at this point. "If either of you has seen anything, please come tell me, okay?" However, Ronan and Bane continued to look up at the sky, completely ignoring him. After a moment, both centaurs spoke simultaneously, "Mars is bright tonight." Hagrid. "Let's go." When he realized he could only rage helplessly, Hagrid ultimately chose to give up. Leaving the two centaurs there, Hagrid led Sherlock around them and continued toward the depths of the Forbidden Forest. "I knew it, there's no point expecting to get clues from them. I mean, you can never get straight answers from centaurs." Hagrid complained as he walked, and you could hear from his tone that he still hadn't recovered from his earlier anger. "They always like to look up at the stars, it's really annoying. Except for things around the moon, they're not interested in anything, and they never speak plainly about anything." Sherlock had already figured this out without Hagrid saying so. Yes, they don't speak human language properly. Understandable. After all, centaurs aren't human. Hearing Sherlock's comment, Hagrid nodded repeatedly. Yes, they just don't speak human language properly. "Sherlock, you really know how to put it." Sherlock couldn't help but find it amusing. This was the first time he'd received such an evaluation. Just then, the two reached a fork in the path. Silver light glittered on the ground. It was the unicorn blood Hagrid had pointed out to Sherlock earlier. Sherlock bent down to observe for a moment and quickly reached a conclusion. The blood is very fresh, proving it left here not long ago. If we're fast enough, we should still be in time to put him out of his misery. I mean, that poor unicorn. Hagrid didn't notice the difference between him and it, but just looked at the two forked paths in front of him with difficulty. "Sherlock, can you tell which way it went?" "Unfortunately, I cannot." Sherlock shook his head. "My suggestion is that we split up." "What? That won't work." Hagrid immediately shook his head vigorously. The Forbidden Forest was so dangerous. How could he let Sherlock act alone? Before saying this, Sherlock had already guessed Hagrid would say this, so he had already thought of a reason. "Don't worry, Hagrid. If I really encounter anything, I'll use my wand to release flames, like this." Sherlock waved his wand as he spoke, and purple fireworks burst from the tip of his wand. It was exactly the magic Dumbledore had used on the night the troll appeared. He had also used it when reminding Hermione at the Quidditch pitch. Hagrid was still somewhat hesitant. He deeply loved the Forbidden Forest and the magical creatures within it, and couldn't bear to see the sacred and pure unicorns suffer harm. But on the other hand, he was also worried that Sherlock would encounter danger if he left his side. Sherlock saw his struggle and simply added fuel to the fire. "Hagrid, you don't want to see another unicorn die because help came too late, do you?" "Hagrid, OD de Grio. All right, then I'll let Fong go with you." This sentence finally made Hagrid make up his mind. "But I have to tell you in advance, he's a coward, but he's alert enough and can warn you of danger in advance. Remember, no matter what happens, you must signal immediately." Sherlock knew that if he didn't accept, Hagrid wouldn't feel at ease. He smiled and took Fong, then added, "Hagrid, you don't have much time left." Hagrid equals epsilon sad face degree winky face. After Hagrid left along the other path, a voice sounded in Sherlock's ear. "Sherlock, what do we do now?" "Put on the invisibility cloak and keep following me," Sherlock said without turning his head. Fong also discovered Harry at this moment. Faced with an invisible person, he immediately became nervous. But when Sherlock patted his head and said the invisible person wasn't an enemy, he calmed down again. Next, Sherlock led Fong and the still invisible Harry deeper into the forest. After walking for nearly half an hour, Sherlock suddenly said, "It seems we're in luck." "What's wrong?" Harry couldn't help but ask. "The truth has come to light. Notice how these silvery white liquids show an irregular shape close to oval, here, and here." Sherlock crouched on the ground, pointing these out to Harry one by one. "They all show obvious drag marks and splatter traces. This indicates the unicorn had accelerated running, jumping, and other intense movements in this area. Obviously, these were left when it was frightened or stimulated and fled. Sherlock raised his head, his gray eyes sparkling. Although Hagrid didn't provide much information, fortunately the unicorn left us important clues. I think we'll be able to meet him soon. Hearing Sherlock's words, Harry immediately became nervous. If we really encounter him? Sherlock directly gave the standard answer. Signal with your wand immediately, then act decisively. Understood. Hearing their leaders say this, Harry immediately became determined. Hadn't Sherlock brought him to the Forbidden Forest precisely for this? That ancient curse. As the group of 2 humans and 1 dog gradually went deeper into the forest, the trees became extremely dense, and even the path became almost impassable. Correspondingly, the blood traces on the ground became denser. Sherlock even found a tree root that had been almost entirely dyed silver. Sherlock crouched down to examine the blood traces, then frowned in thought. Fong also became increasingly agitated. He even began trying to bite Sherlock's robes, wanting to lead him back the way they came. Shoo! Sherlock naturally wouldn't turn back halfway. After calming Fong, he stood up again. Harry, stay hidden. After crossing the tree root and walking a few more steps, Sherlock stopped. The silvery white blood traces crossed over an ancient oak tree at this point, and ahead was a clearing. Painful, miserable sounds came from there, and something white was glittering on the ground. It was the unicorn Hagrid had been desperately seeking. Only its current condition was very poor. Its 4 legs still maintained the position from when it fell, its pure white mane spread across the black fallen leaves, and its somewhat dim eyes still faintly showed a pleading look. Obviously, although this unicorn was still alive, it was already dying. Sherlock didn't act rashly and also signaled Harry and Fong to stay in place and observe quietly. As he had predicted, the bushes at the edge of the clearing began to shake. Sherlock perked up immediately and turned his attention there. A hooded figure emerged from the shadows and began crawling toward the unicorn lying on the ground. Clearly human, but this crawling posture was like a dark beast at this moment, making one's blood run cold. Both Harry and Fong were stunned by the scene before them. The human and dog froze in place as if they had lost the ability to move. Sherlock, who had been mentally prepared, certainly wouldn't be like them. He slowly raised his wand, aiming at the cloaked figure. Although fists were very useful, Sherlock hadn't forgotten that he was now a wizard. The figure that emerged from the shadows finally crawled to the unicorn's side and slowly lowered his head. Shockingly, he actually began drinking the unicorn's blood from its wound. The unicorn, whose eyes had originally been dim, seemed to sense the passing of its own life and let out a tragic neigh. Even though its legs had been broken, it still struggled unwillingly, and the horn on its forehead burst forth with brilliant white light. It seemed to hope this light could drive away the shadow of death enveloping it. Unfortunately, even the strongest light couldn't stop what was happening before its eyes. At this moment, Sherlock hesitated no longer. The spell he had prepared long ago shot directly at that figure. Petrificus totalis. With the element of surprise, the crawling person who was harming the unicorn completely hadn't expected to be ambushed. He was hit by Sherlock's full bodybind curse and fell backward into the bushes. Seeing his spell hit the target, Sherlock didn't let his guard down. At this moment, Harry and Fong finally regained their ability to move. Fong yelped and ran away. Just as Hagrid had said, he really was a coward. Harry overcame his fear and was about to send up fireworks as Sherlock had said. However, at this crucial moment, severe pain pierced through his head, as if his scar had suddenly caught fire. This was a feeling he'd never had before. Even last time when facing Snape, it should have been Quirrell, it hadn't hurt this much. Harry's vision blurred as he staggered backward. Sherlock only glanced once, then immediately cast another spell toward where the dark figure had fallen without hesitation. Confringo! The formed blasting curse was very powerful, equivalent to dozens of kilograms of TNT explosives. However, after touching an object, it would bounce around aimlessly. If the caster was very close, there was a high possibility of injuring oneself. Fortunately, Sherlock only had a general target at this moment, and the distance was far enough. It was the perfect opportunity to cast the blasting curse. However, Sherlock didn't think his second spell would be effective. Sure enough, there was only a cold snort, and a magical barrier appeared out of nowhere, directly deflecting Sherlock's spell. At the same time, a sinister voice roared, "Ruining my good work, die." After the opponent used the shield charm to deflect the blasting curse, he flicked his wrist and shouted fiercely, "Reducto!" Surging black waves poured from the front of the spell, rushing toward Sherlock with the momentum to destroy everything. When did the reducing curse have such power? How did a perfectly normal offensive spell become like dark magic in his hands? Because Sherlock had already anticipated the opponent's counterattack before casting his spell, he had already dodged to the side before the opponent raised his hand. Taking advantage of the gap while the opponent prepared his next attack, he cast another spell. Impedimenta. Sherlock's observation skills were very keen. This was especially true after entering combat. From the moment the opponent began drinking the unicorn's blood, he realized this guy's condition was wrong. Especially after casting that reducing curse just now, he was breathing heavily and even his movements became somewhat sluggish. Hagrid's description plus his own understanding of magical creatures made Sherlock's mind crystal clear. For this guy who desperately needed to maintain his life force and magical power, nothing was more important than killing a unicorn and drinking its blood heartily. Most importantly, he couldn't afford to drag this out. Never mind Dumbledore. Even if Hagrid, who was nearby, rushed over, it would be enough trouble for him. So, after throwing an impediment jinx, Sherlock accelerated toward his opponent. He was indeed a wizard, but close combat was his advantage. By the time the opponent reacted, Sherlock had already reached behind him. Even hit by the impediment jinx, the black-robed wizard's reaction wasn't slow. A shield charm was cast silently. However, he never expected that what attacked him wasn't a spell. The sharp sword that had long been unsheathed stabbed into the opponent's soft ribs at a tricky angle. The blade was cold and sharp, flickering with resolute light in the dim illumination, echoing with the wand in his right hand. Blood was drawn. Unfortunately, the magical barrier created by the shield charm could not only deflect spells but also act on physical objects. So, this sword thrust was ultimately too shallow and didn't hit a vital spot. At the same time, brilliant red flames soared into the sky. Harry endured the severe pain in his forehead, covering his scar with one hand while pointing his wand toward the sky with the other, sending up the agreed signal. Damn it! The black-robed wizard let out an angry roar and prepared to leave first. Once Dumbledore saw the signal and rushed over, he absolutely couldn't escape in his current state. Unexpectedly, his waist suddenly felt intense pain again. It was Sherlock pulling out his sword, preparing to strike again. He was immediately shocked. An 11-year-old young wizard actually wanted to go for a second strike when facing him? Were Gryffindors this brave? How dare you? After surprise came extreme anger. Impedimenta. Though it was the same impediment jinx, the black-robed wizard who had been hit still had enough strength to cast a shield charm to protect himself. Sherlock's second sword thrust could no longer be delivered. At the same time, that figure retreated rapidly like an arrow released from a bow. Sherlock regained normal movement but didn't let his guard down. He put away his wand and took out a round shield he had prepared in advance. Crucio! A shrill shout came from the direction where the black-robed wizard had fled. The Cruciatus Curse's scarlet light even changed the color of the forest in the dark night. Being cautious, Sherlock didn't raise his shield to block but directly threw the shield out while dodging to the side. Boom! The Cruciatus Curse hit the shield squarely, and the explosive aftershock from the collision between the two sides kicked up large amounts of earth. But the spell was ultimately blocked by the shield. Sherlock breathed a long sigh of relief. This time he had really left. If he didn't leave now, it would really be too late. At this moment, Harry ran to Sherlock's side and helped him up. Sherlock, I'm sorry. Just now my scar. Sherlock stood up with Harry's help. Although he couldn't see the other person, he still patted his shoulder and said, Dear Harry, severe pain prevented you from concentrating. This isn't your fault. How do you know? Harry was stunned, then thought of Sherlock's special abilities and said regretfully, But I didn't help you at all. We came together, but in the end, you had to fight him alone. If you hadn't successfully sent the signal, he wouldn't have left so quickly. After saying this, Sherlock pointed to the ground nearby and said, Harry, can you help me pick that up? Harry then picked up the shield that had just blocked the Cruciatus Curse. But when Harry held it in his hands, he was shocked to discover that this wasn't a shield at all. It was clearly the rock cake that Sherlock had once taken from Hagrid's hut. However, these rock cakes had obviously been processed now, layered together with a handle added to one side. Harry was stunned with amazement. Sherlock, you actually turned it into armor. This incident shocked Harry so much that he even forgot his guilt. He couldn't help but remember what Sherlock had once said to him and Ron. If you don't treat it as food but as weapons and armor, it becomes very practical. He had actually done it. Sherlock seemed to see through Harry's thoughts and smiled. It is indeed very practical, isn't it? Harry, What else could he say? He could only admire to the point of bowing down. A large creature is rapidly approaching. If I'm not mistaken, it should be Hagrid. Sherlock sheathed his sword and rockskin shield, turning to Harry. Harry, if possible, I hope you can continue to remain invisible. Harry nodded. For various reasons, he didn't want Hagrid to know he was also in the Forbidden Forest tonight. Sherlock. Good heavens, what on earth happened here? When Hagrid arrived and saw the battlefield before him and the dying unicorn, he was so shocked he could barely speak, only tugging at his beard frantically. Hey, hold on. First, see if it can still be saved. Sherlock pointed to the unicorn with both legs broken. Oh, Merlin's beard. Who could have hurt it like this? Wait. At this point, he suddenly noticed the bite marks on the unicorn's wounds. Someone has been drinking its blood. Hagrid's eyes immediately widened to the size of copper bells. Hagrid, I think you should understand what this means. Even when dying, unicorn blood can sustain life, but only if willingly given. However, if someone forcibly takes the blood to save their own life, then from the moment that blood touches their lips, they will have a half-dead existence, a cursed life. Sherlock spoke slowly, seemingly making a statement, but actually explaining to Harry, who stood invisible nearby. This time, Harry understood completely. The one he had just faced was none other than the murderer of his parents, the Dark Lord who made the entire wizarding world tremble, Voldemort. But he didn't seem that strong after all. Harry understood, but Hagrid didn't. Sherlock didn't expect him to understand anyway. His main task was to examine the severely injured unicorn. Fortunately, although the unicorn was badly hurt, because Sherlock intervened in time, it could still be saved. With this, the investigation into the unicorn attacks in the Forbidden Forest was concluded. Hagrid thought Sherlock was very lucky to have figured everything out on just the first night. Sherlock knew clearly that it was because the enemy couldn't wait any longer. His desperate actions just now proved this point even more. Next was to tell Dumbledore everything and let him solve the problem. As a leader, this was what he should be doing anyway. In any case, after today's events, the enemy certainly wouldn't come to the Forbidden Forest again. On the way back, Hagrid also found Fong, who had run far away, and a centaur. However, this centaur they encountered was neither Ronan nor Bane. From his appearance, this centaur looked younger and more handsome. He had platinum-colored hair, the body of a silver-maned horse, and a pair of light blue eyes, looking exactly like a white horse prince from fairy tales. Firenze! How good to see you! Obviously, this was another of Hagrid's acquaintances. Hello, Hagrid, what's that? A unicorn. Is it all right? When Firenze saw Hagrid carrying a unicorn with broken legs, the centaur immediately panicked. It was that creature lurking in our forest who did this, wasn't it? Calm down, Firenze. Hagrid patted the unicorn he was carrying. Fortunately, Sherlock arrived in time. It didn't lose its life, and that poacher was driven away. Thank heavens. Getting this answer, Firenze let out a long sigh of relief. Then he turned his gaze to Sherlock. Thank you for saving this poor unicorn. Firenze's attitude toward Sherlock was much warmer, forming a sharp contrast with the previously dismissive Ronan and Bane. Your name is Sherlock Holmes? I've heard of you. You're a remarkable child. Hearing this, Hagrid immediately slapped Sherlock on the shoulder. I never thought you'd be so famous among the centaurs. Before this, I thought only Harry could achieve that. Just then, more hoofbeats came from the other side of the clearing. It was Ronan and Bane, whom they had met before. Sherlock's gaze swept over them, noticing their flanks heaving violently and dripping with sweat. They had obviously just engaged in some vigorous activity. Firenze! Bane called out Firenze's name as soon as he arrived. Bane, I'm not deaf. You don't need to speak so loudly. Firenze's tone was not polite. What did you tell him? Bane said angrily. Remember, Firenze, we swore never to defy fate. Haven't we seen the omens shown by the movements of the planets? Ronan shuffled his hooves restlessly in the dirt, continuing to explain for Firenze in his melancholy voice. I believe Firenze thought he was acting entirely out of good intentions. Good intentions? What does this have to do with us? However, Bane was not appeased and continued his angry outburst. Centaurs care about the prophecies of the stars. We have no need to run around like donkeys following lost humans in our forest. This immediately angered Hagrid. But before he could react, Firenze had already reared up on his hind legs. This was an action centaurs only took when extremely angry. didn't you see that unicorn? Accompanying this action, Firenze also began roaring at Bane. Don't you understand why it was killed? Or didn't the planets reveal this secret to you? Listen, I must resist that creature lurking in our forest, Bane. Yes, if necessary, I will stand with humans. After saying this, he no longer paid attention to Bane and Ronan, lowering his front legs again while indicating that Sherlock and Hagrid should leave with him. Sherlock and Hagrid naturally had no objections. After all, they both disliked riddle chatterers. Only after completely leaving Bane and Ronan behind did Firenze stop and turn to Sherlock. Holmes, do you know why Bane was so angry just now? Hagrid laughed. Firenze, you never speak directly about anything. Even Sherlock couldn't guess, right, Sherlock? I can roughly deduce something. Hagrid was stunned, while Firenze's eyes lit up. Let's hear it. Simple. He just didn't want you to tell us the results you obtained from observing the stars. Firenze's blue eyes became even brighter. Not bad. Do you know what the results are? Sherlock sighed. Obviously, the one who harmed the unicorn was Voldemort. When Sherlock spoke this name, Hagrid involuntarily gasped. The invisible Harry couldn't help but pull his cloak tighter, feeling as if the temperature around him had suddenly dropped. Impossible. Absolutely impossible. Hagrid shook his massive head violently. Hogwarts has Dumbledore. You know who couldn't possibly get in. Firenze's reaction to Voldemort's name was far less dramatic than Hagrid's. He merely looked at Sherlock with considerable approval. Holmes, you're exactly as I've heard. I think you should study divination. Divination? Sherlock shook his head. This is a result I deduced through scientific methods. It has nothing to do with divination. The stars told me the prophecy, but you say you used science. When saying this word, the centaur Firenze's expression was somewhat subtle. After all, talking about science in a magical world always felt a bit strange. Actually, deducing this was simple. Seeing Sherlock like this, the still invisible Harry smiled knowingly. He knew his friend was about to begin again. Unicorn blood carries a curse when forcibly taken. For normal people, living half-dead with a curse for a lifetime is worse than dying cleanly. Unless the purpose is only to sustain life long enough for the cursed person to obtain something else that can completely restore energy and magic. It so happens that the school is keeping the Philosopher's Stone, which can make the elixir of life. For Voldemort, who has been dormant for years and wants to make a comeback, I don't think he would pass up this opportunity. This time, Firenze was completely stunned. Sherlock, you already told me this. Just as Firenze was shocked, Hagrid seemed to have enlightenment. So you had already thought of this back then. The invisible Harry nearly stumbled. Their giant friend was really too slow. But even though he belatedly understood Sherlock's deduction process, Hagrid still muttered, although your skills are impressive, Sherlock, I think you're wrong this time. As long as Dumbledore is at the school, you know who won't succeed. It was clear that his trust in Dumbledore had risen to a level of blind worship. Sherlock didn't argue. Firenze softly said, this isn't just deduction, it's also centaur divination. Hagrid, you know we're rarely wrong. But you're wrong this time. You too, Sherlock. Seeing that Hagrid had entered a state of indiscriminate attack, Firenze stopped saying more. Mainly because he understood Hagrid's personality and knew there was nothing good to say to him in this situation. Soon, the three people, one centaur, one unicorn, and one dog reached the edge of the forbidden forest. We'll part ways here. Firenze stopped and looked at Sherlock and Hagrid. Good luck to you. In the past, the stars of fate have been misunderstood, and even centaurs make mistakes. I hope this is one of those times. Looking at the centaur who, unlike Ronan and Bane, continued to show him kindness, Sherlock added something more. Actually, I think there's a phrase more suitable for your divination results today. Firenze looked puzzled. What? Suddenly there's a madman sharpening his blade at night. The Emperor's star wavers while Mars burns high. After saying this, Sherlock waved to Firenze and walked toward the castle with Hagrid. By nightfall, a mad blade is drawn, the star of kings shivers, and Mars watches from above. Firenze repeated this phrase several times silently. Suddenly, his eyes became startlingly blue for a moment, like pale sapphires. Indeed, this phrase is much more suitable than Mars is bright tonight. Firenze held great reverence for fate. This was the same as other centaurs. But in an environment where other centaurs generally despised wizards, he wasn't so rejecting of humans and didn't hesitate to lend a helping hand when humans were in danger. This made him an anomaly among centaurs. Tonight's attitude from Ronan and Bane was the best illustration. Those familiar with divination know that Mars is always associated with elements like war, conflict, and violence. The centaur Ronan's constant repetition to Sherlock and Hagrid that Mars is bright was essentially hinting that the magical world was facing potential crisis and turmoil. After 10 years of peace, war might be coming. Dark forces were rising, very likely to cause conflict and disaster. All of this closely related to Voldemort's resurrection and his designs on the Philosopher's Stone. Unfortunately, centaurs never spoke plainly. So, they could only express their viewpoint by repeatedly saying this phrase. But this phrase, Mars is bright tonight, compared to what Sherlock said, by nightfall, a mad blade is drawn, the Star of Kings shivers, and Mars watches from above. The two were vastly different. The two phrases actually expressed the same meaning, but the latter's artistic conception completely overwhelmed the former. Firenze made up his mind. When he returned to the centaur community, he would also use this phrase to replace Mars is bright tonight. This perfectly fits centaur characteristics, making people feel impressed without understanding why. Firenze didn't realize that Sherlock's seemingly casual action would greatly change his status within the centaur community. Meanwhile, Sherlock was explaining to the curious Hagrid and the cloaked Harry, "This Christmas, a classmate gave me a strange book. It was full of unusual content, including mysterious symbols and stories from various countries translated in English. This phrase comes from this book." Hagrid listened with half understanding and couldn't help asking, "Why did you tell it this?" "Just hoping that this centaur friend who showed us kindness could have an easier time when he returns. Now, Hagrid, please quickly settle that unicorn, or our headmaster will be going to sleep." Hagrid quickly tended to the injured unicorn, then rushed with Sherlock to the headmaster's office. Seeing the two of them, Dumbledore seemed somewhat helpless. "Can't you show some consideration for this old man? What's so important that it can't wait until tomorrow?" Dumbledore was wearing pajamas covered with stars, obviously having been about to sleep. "Sir, you know me." Hearing Dumbledore's words, Hagrid felt somewhat embarrassed. "If there wasn't something important, Dear Rubius, of course I know you. It seems the Forbidden Forest matter has new developments." Dumbledore asked understandingly. Hagrid nodded heavily. "Yes. Although we saved the unicorn, that poacher escaped. Sherlock even came face to face with him." Seeing Hagrid's lips trembling, unable to speak the name, Dumbledore wasn't surprised. He simply turned his gaze to Sherlock. It was Voldemort. Hagrid immediately shuddered and gasped. He didn't notice that the space beside him trembled unnaturally for a moment. Dumbledore's lenses flashed, and his gaze turned to Hagrid again, saying in a gentle voice, "Hagrid, could you please step out for a moment?" Hagrid, degree. After the dejected Hagrid left the headmaster's office, Dumbledore glanced at Sherlock and smiled. "I thought you would advise me to let Hagrid stay." "No need. What we're about to discuss indeed isn't suitable for him to know," Sherlock said calmly. "He's like he was born having taken Veritaserum. That comparison is truly vivid and apartment." Dumbledore was first stunned, then laughed again. "Well, but I think your other friend can show himself now, right?" Harry in the invisibility cloak remained motionless. Having spent so much time with Sherlock, Harry was no longer as naive as when he first entered school. Who knew if Dumbledore was bluffing? "Show yourself. You were discovered the moment you entered the office." Once Sherlock said this, Harry immediately removed the invisibility cloak without hesitation. He looked at Dumbledore somewhat embarrassedly. "Sir, sorry, I didn't think you could detect me." "Strange, you actually became more confident after becoming invisible." Noticing that Dumbledore still had a smile on his face, Harry relaxed. Good. Dumbledore wasn't angry. "So, Sherlock, how did you know I had discovered Harry?" "Simple. An observant person, if he observes precisely and systematically what he encounters, can deduce a person's deepest thoughts from their momentary expressions, every muscle movement, and every turn of their eyes. When Hagrid and I just entered, your gaze not only focused on us but also lingered for 3 seconds on a position beside me, exactly where Harry was standing. Also, when Hagrid mentioned Voldemort just now, your gaze shifted to his position again. 2 confirmations were enough to prove the point." Dumbledore showed a thoughtful expression. After a moment, he waved his wand, conjuring 2 cups of lemonade and sending them to Sherlock and Harry. "Have a drink first." Sherlock didn't move. Harry said thanks and grabbed his cup, drinking it all at once. Although he hadn't directly participated in combat tonight, Following Sherlock in and out of the Forbidden Forest had consumed considerable energy, and he indeed needed to replenish fluids. Then he regretted it. Too damn sweet. God knows how much sugar Dumbledore had added to this water. He could no longer taste the lemon sourness at all. Only then did he notice that Sherlock hadn't touched his cup, and began secretly admiring his friend's foresight. Dumbledore seemed not to notice this scene. He asked in a peaceful voice, "So, tonight there were actually 2 people who participated in the battle, not 1, right?" Harry felt somewhat ashamed. "Sir, this time it was all thanks to Sherlock. I only managed to shoot fireworks into the sky." "No, Harry. If you hadn't done that, Voldemort wouldn't have left so quickly." "But never mind these details." Dumbledore adjusted his glasses. "You did very well tonight. I believe your friend thinks so too." "Well said." Sherlock agreed with Dumbledore. "In fact, I made an oversight in tonight's operation." "An oversight? What oversight?" Hearing Sherlock's words, Dumbledore immediately became interested. For this genius he considered superior to that person, his curiosity was extraordinarily strong. Sherlock didn't answer but drew his wand and waved it. Purple sparks immediately burst from the wand tip. "Very nice warning charm. I used it on Halloween. I didn't expect you to apply it practically so quickly." Dumbledore nodded approvingly, then changed the subject, "But this doesn't seem related to our previous topic. Harry shot red sparks when he encountered Voldemort." Sherlock said calmly. Dumbledore understood immediately. Harry was stunned for a moment before realizing, I never thought of that." "Rubius didn't think of it either, did he?" Dumbledore smiled. "Believe me, Harry, he'll forget about this soon." "But not everyone is Hagrid," Sherlock said with a serious face. "Before the battle, I should have told Harry this." "All right, Sherlock. You've done well enough today. If it were me when I first entered Hogwarts, I wouldn't have done as well as you. Yes, after all, you didn't have a powerful headmaster supporting you to fight the Dark Lord." Dumbledore. Having experienced Sherlock's sharp tongue again, Dumbledore decisively decided to bypass this topic first. "In fact, Voldemort's craving for unicorn blood far exceeds your imagination. That you could stop him today is already the greatest victory." Sherlock frowned, disagreeing with Dumbledore. Unicorn blood can only let him extend his life while cursed. The Philosopher's Stone is his real target. "That's because you don't know that unicorn blood has another effect that few people know about." Sherlock looked at Dumbledore with some surprise. Dumbledore said calmly, "That is to create a temporary body cursed by dark magic." Like lightning flashing through his mind, Sherlock immediately connected all the clues. If this was the case, then today's encounter with Voldemort brought greater gains than imagined. No wonder Quirrell, or rather Voldemort, didn't drink the blood after killing the unicorn. Because what he needed was for the unicorn to watch helplessly as its life ebbed away bit by bit while being powerless to stop it, so the unicorn would maintain maximum resentment before death. Speaking of which, with Sherlock's reading about many stories, he had indeed seen many similar settings in those fictional books. For example, in literary works from Muggle worlds, evil mages liked to use this method to forge dark magical artifacts. As a dark wizard, Voldemort was in some ways inferior to those fictional evil mages. After all, according to descriptions in those literary works, the people Voldemort had killed in his lifetime was equivalent to what those mages slaughtered in a single day to sacrifice for their artifacts. But it wasn't really a problem. Different circumstances and fiction is fiction. By this time, Harry had already told Dumbledore everything that happened tonight in detail. During this process, Sherlock made no additions. Because he discovered that Harry indeed had talent for description and summary. The current Voldemort is already very weak. From his hasty actions and tonight's battle process, his control over Quirrell isn't as perfect as I imagined, so. After listening to Harry's account, Dumbledore pondered briefly, then said in a gentle voice, "I hope you can defeat him once more." "Me?" Harry looked incredulous. He pointed to his own nose and couldn't help asking, "Sir, I'm just a first-year student who hasn't even learned many offensive spells. You want me to deal with Voldemort and Quirrell?" If this world didn't have Sherlock, when Dumbledore entrusted this task to him, Harry might have thought heaven was bestowing great responsibility upon him. Bearing a special mission and with the added motivation of avenging his parents, even without Dumbledore speaking, he would have been hot-headed enough to confront Voldemort directly. But having spent so much time with Sherlock, Harry had grown a brain. Now that Dumbledore still wanted to use the old tactics on him, they naturally lost their effect. Hearing Harry's question, Dumbledore was somewhat surprised. Harry shouldn't be this type of person, but he quickly understood where the problem lay. His gaze turned to Sherlock. Sherlock,